Good evening, Northamptonshire Natural History Society. This is Wild Astronomy. And if you look at the top left, you see the subtitle, Wildlife by Day, Stars by Night. And you might want to add, Sleep when you get home. If you're going to go somewhere exotic with wonderful dark skies, then make sure you make the most of it. So what do I mean by wild astronomy? Well, some friends and I have taken a few holidays in the past, and we realised that we've had, for quite a few years, an overlap of interests. We're interested in wildlife, we're interested in photography, which of course overlaps with wildlife if you're interested in wildlife photography, and we've had long interest in astronomy. And of course, again, astronomy overlaps with photography, especially if you're interested in astrophotography. And all of these three, when combined, is what I call wild astronomy. Going somewhere in the middle of nowhere, preferably on safari, to East Africa, where you can get really dark skies and enjoy the wildlife, enjoy the astronomy, and enjoy the photography of both. So I'm going to be talking about going on safari, where you might want to go, what you could take, a little bit about accommodation, lodges and camps where you can stay, how to see the wildlife on game drives, and how to make the most of your time by photographing the wildlife. And then I'll be talking about astrophotography under the darkest skies. So as you can perhaps see, in this particular talk, there's probably more wild than there is astronomy. So let's have a look at going on safari. I'm talking about holidays that I've been to with some friends in Kenya and Tanzania in East Africa. And we visited various different lodges and camps and national parks, which are shown there. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but the particular locations will appear in a little banner at the bottom of each image. So when you're going on safari, it's a good idea to take a few things with you, probably a hat and some sun cream, maybe some insect spray and some malaria tablets because the insect spray doesn't always work. And a good bird book is not a bad idea, and of course a pair of binoculars. Now for photography, back in the old days, and I'm sure some of you will remember the good old days where if you went on holiday you had to decide how much film you would take with you. On a couple of weeks on safari, it was a question of, do I take 10 or do I take 20 rolls of film? Will that be enough, or am I going to run out? These days with digital cameras, you just take an SD card. Okay, I probably wouldn't take a terabyte SD card, but with a capacity of hundreds of thousands of images, you're never going to run out of space. Now, having got to Africa, you get to the airport, jump on a bus, and hopefully before long you're taken somewhere into the wilds. In the bottom left, that's just a random picture of a view into the African bush. One thing to notice is that the more you look, the more you see. So here we have a wooded area with a few zebra floating around, and then you realise, there's actually an elephant tucked behind that bush. Oh, look, there's a giraffe as well. Oh, look, there's a couple more elephant. And if we look further, another giraffe, and another elephant, and another giraffe. And that's fairly typical. If you just spend a few minutes looking, you realise there's far more going on than you perhaps see at first sight. But you don't have to go out looking for the animals. If you prefer, the image in the top right shows that if you find yourself the right camp or the right lodge, you can, if you wish, just sit on the terrace, and especially one that is overlooking a watering hole, you can just sit there all day if you wish and let the animals come to you. So let's have a look at a few lodges and camps that exist in East Africa. That's fairly typical that a lot of lodges will be either on the side of lakes or will have wonderful views over grasslands. The lodges themselves, my friends and I are of a similar age and we're not interested in slumming it. So we will choose lodges or camps that have very comfortable rooms, as you can see, a comfortable bed, mosquito nets where appropriate, and all of the comforts of home effectively, especially the sanitation, toilets and showers, etc. Everywhere you go. A lot of lodges will be a little bit like this in the sense that they will be built in places that tourists want to go. They will have fantastic views, in this case one overlooking the Masai Mara. Similar lodges exist looking over the plains of the Serengeti. So yes, there will be a few modern conveniences, but my friends and I go for the view rather than anything else. And this particular lodge in Tsavo West National Park is one of our favourites. You can see here relaxing on the terrace, overlooking the watering hole. Okay, at this particular point when the picture was taken, there don't appear to be many animals there, but the animals will come and go throughout the day and indeed throughout the night as well. And you can see here a person in their element, set up with a camera pointing towards the watering hole, binoculars round the neck, spanning the bird book, slipping through the bird book with a pot of coffee on the go there. So for many people, spending a few hours just sitting there watching the animals come and go is wonderful. And that's a picture taken from that terrace of some eland that came to drink around about sunrise, so the sun is hitting them from behind us. Not ideal in terms of lighting, but still a very nice reflection in the water when they decided to come to drink. The watering holes are often floodlit. The animals don't seem to mind that. As far as they're concerned, it's just like having a full moon now and again. So they don't mind having the watering holes lit. So they will come, and again the tourists can watch the animals and photograph the animals well into the evening if you so wish. It was during one of these safaris back in 2003, more than 20 years ago now, that I wondered, given that the skies are beautifully dark as we are a long way from any light pollution, I wonder what it would be like to photograph the sky. So I simply put the camera on a tripod and took a short exposure. So this was with Fuji slide film back in 2003. So because the exposure was a few minutes, the stars have moved slightly, so we can see the brighter stars, but it's difficult to see the fainter stars, and although there's a bit of a smudge in the middle where the Milky Way ought to be, there's not a lot can be seen. That's partly due to the lack of sensitivity of slide film. This was either 100 or 200 ISO taken back in the day. So it made me think that, well, it's beautiful dark skies, but it's a shame you can't really capture it with a camera too well. So I didn't think too much about that. There are various lodges throughout Kenya and Tanzania, all of which have a certain character of their own. In this particular case, all of the rooms are on these rather odd stilts so that everybody gets a really nice view from their room over the grasslands. Some parts of the country can be a little dry, especially during drought season, but as indicated in this photograph, there are plenty of regions which are really lush, partly due to the rainfall and partly due to underground aquifers which keep various areas lush with green. One particular favourite for astrophotographers is this particular lodge in Amboseli National Park. The lodge is called Oltukai Lodge, and there you can see my friend sitting in front of one of their rooms. It's in beautiful grounds, wonderful open area, great for people wanting to do bird walks. But if we look with a slightly different angle, apart from noticing that, well, there appears to be a prevailing wind, which you might notice there, although there are plenty of trees, which might make astrophotography a bit tricky, if you notice to the right-hand side, the trees thin out a bit, which means if you walk a short distance from your room out to the edge of the compound, you can get away from the trees and see the sky quite nicely. But also of importance, at the right-hand edge here, we can see an electric fence. Now, if you're going out at night, that's quite important to make sure that none of the animals that you don't want to be very close to are going to get close to you. So this particular lodge with an electric fence which stays electrified all night is a great place to do astrophotography. So again, back in 2003, I decided to try a couple of images. That's one from me and one from one of my friends. We had different camera setups, different film, and we took different exposures. I took a relatively long exposure on the left, so you can see the stars have trailed quite a lot. My friend took a somewhat shorter exposure, in which case you can start to see structure in the Milky Way a little more clearly because the field of view hasn't blurred quite so much in the long exposure. But pictures like this give a tantalizing glimpse of the amount of detail that could in principle be brought out of these astrophotos, but without any ability to move the camera. With the camera on a fixed tripod, we're always going to have star trails. So this was interesting, but a little bit frustrating. There were plenty of places where you're not necessarily in a lodge, but in tented camps, camps that are basically a collection of tents. The tents are not simply a one-man bivouac, they're still relatively comfortable, with comfortable sleeping arrangements and again good sanitation. A tent like this, surrounded by trees, not so good for astrophotography. But other places, like this particular camp, Governor's Camp, next to the Mara River, you can see the tent itself is in the shade of the trees, but it's clear that if you walk a short distance outside your tent, there are areas which are clear of trees and good for astrophotography. But we were told, beware, do not leave your tent at night. This is one particular camp, there are many, which do not have an electric fence, which means when you're safely in your tent at night, animals are free to run throughout the camp. I assumed that they wouldn't actually visit because animals, generally speaking, will want to avoid people rather than come into the camps. But there are circumstances where animals will roam. And we were told, don't leave your tent at night because there are wild animals. I thought maybe this is just something to get the tourists interested, but one morning on this path outside my tent I found this imprint, which I'm told by the locals is a lioness print. So yes, a lioness had walked outside my tent during the night and I was unaware of that. So perhaps we have to heed the warnings. If they say don't leave your tent at night, then probably astrophotography is not such a good idea. That's why I tend to only do astrophotography where there is an electric fence and we know it's safe. This is the Rufiji River Camp in Tanzania, the Selous Game Reserve. And this is another place. Back in 2005, I tried a few snaps of the night sky. This is a little bit further south than the lodges I'd visited in Kenya. And so I could see a little bit further south, and again here we see a part of the Milky Way. There's the centre of the galaxy on the left-hand side, the familiar constellation of Scorpius for those who know their constellations. And again, the structure visible in the Milky Way, even with an exposure of a few minutes trailing all of the stars, there is still clearly a lot of detail visible within the Milky Way. And looking a little bit further south, Alpha and Beta Centauri, the Southern Cross and the Coalsack Nebula. So again, tantalizing detail, but it became clear to me in 2005 that I was not going to get any decent pictures of the sky unless I could get rid of the star trails. So I decided to build myself a star tracker and take it on the next safari. And we'll see the results of that in a little while. Meanwhile, back to the animals. As well as staying put in lodges and camps and overlooking a watering hole and doing things the lazy way by just sitting there all day and waiting for the animals, you can, if you wish, go on game drives. Typically just after sunrise or just before sunset, when the animals can be quite active. During the middle of the day they might be asleep. Some are nocturnal and hunt at night, but around sunrise and sunset there are lots of animals to be seen, and that's when the light is at its best. So there's friends and I and our safari van about to go out on a game drive. You can see that although there's Kilimanjaro in the background, a friend and me there, notice that throughout the van we tend to put little pan and tilt heads simply to make life easier, regardless of what particular focal length lens we happen to be using. Having a pan and tilt head just means that we don't have the weight of the camera on a strap around our necks, and it just makes everything a little bit steadier. Of course, people moving within the van makes it move, and we don't tend to take images whilst the van is on the move. So whenever we're parked up, we tend to put a camera on top of the pan and tilt heads, and then we have a nice stable platform from which to do our astrophotography. Now you could ask, well, do you need a long telephoto lens if you're looking at animals that could be quite some distance away? What sort of telephoto do you need if you're going on safari? Well, contrary to popular belief, you don't need something like this. I mean, look at the biceps on that guy. The Sigma 200 to 500 is a whopping telephoto lens, but you don't need anything that large. Those interested in birds in particular might go for particularly long focal lengths. If you're trying to photograph something which is half a kilometre away, then perhaps you really do need a good focal length. But I have found, after taking quite a few safaris in East Africa, the ideal lens for me is actually a 300mm. There's it is on the bottom left there. Not much bigger than the palm of your hand. 300mm f4 lens, very small, very light, and therefore it doesn't add much to your luggage or the weight around your neck if you are walking around with it. And I have found that 300mm is all you need. I don't even use teleconverters with that to push it any higher to 400 or 600mm. So can you get close enough to animals with a 300mm lens? I would argue, yes, you do. So here's a picture of a lion taken on the Masai Mara with a 300mm lens. And I hope you agree that really this is about as close as you really want to get to any animal. Why would you want to get a frame any tighter than that? You can get fantastic resolution with an animal that's only 10 or 20 meters away. And in principle, they might be more distant than that. But if that's the case, then you can just take a slightly tighter crop on the image you've taken. Predators like lions are not worried about tourists. Prey animals who are always looking out for something that might kill them, they can be a little more skittish. But even, for instance, impala, some of the antelope family, who are always on the lookout and are always wary of people, even they can get close enough, or you can get close enough to them, that it's no problem with a 300mm lens getting a nice close-up. Bear in mind that the rule in Kenya is that you shouldn't approach any animal within 25 meters. Anything closer than that is considered to be harassing the animals. But if you do stop 25 meters away from an animal and it decides to walk towards you, well, that's fine. You don't have to back off. And that's what sometimes happens, especially with predators who basically ignore tourists because they are not a threat. And this happened a number of different times. This particular lion, again, to give you an impression of how far away the lion is, there a friend of mine has just taken a picture of my left ear, and you can see that a lion is quite happy sitting down within 10 meters of you because, again, they do not see you as a threat. The same for leopards that happen to be walking past you. They might start 50 meters away, but they are not too fussed if they walk past you, and therefore you can simply park in their path and they will just walk past you, barely giving you a glance. And so you get opportunities to take really good close-ups. There have been times when I've been photographing elephants when they get so close that you really do need a wide-angle lens to get them all in. So let's have a think about wildlife photography. There are an awful lot of animals in East Africa. There's a panorama which I produced from a single spot when the wildebeest were passing through. And I'm sure you can't see the detail in this wide panorama. If I blow up a part of it, perhaps you can see that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of wildebeest and zebra and other animals mixed in as well. Being a scientist, I looked at this vista and I tried to estimate how many animals are there per 10 square meters or 10 meters square, looked at the horizon and tried to work out what size of herd I was looking at. And I think from this particular vantage point, we could see perhaps 1 million wildebeest. And that sort of number, 1.5, 2 million wildebeest, migrate from the Serengeti through the Masai Mara and then back again every year. They follow the grass follows the rain. And in the sky, it can be equally rich as well. On visiting a lake, we were expecting to see perhaps a few flamingo, but as it happens, we saw a flock of 1,000 pelicans take to the air and wheel around above our heads. And if you remember that pelicans are very large birds compared to what we're used to, it was really quite a sight. We have to remember that although some animals are a bit skittish and will tend to move away when tourists approach them, a lot of animals are actually quite curious about us. They're wondering who we are and what we're doing there. So it's not unusual to find zebra or giraffe or occasionally lions who are interested in us, not necessarily for food, but just interested in what we're doing and why we are there. This particular lioness sat on this log not to get a good view of us. Well, maybe it was to get a good view of us, because what's going on is that she has cubs who are walking across our line of sight in this long grass. We can't see them in this particular image, but they're down there in the grass, and the lioness put herself onto the bough of this tree and occasionally glanced round at us, just to make it clear that she was in charge and she was staying between us and her cubs to make sure her cubs were protected. So it's interesting how you get animal behaviour coming through in just one or two snaps. So most of the time she was looking forward, but when she did look over her shoulder, it produced a very nice image. Sometimes the grass is really long. Sometimes the areas are swampy. Sometimes with very little rain, you can get a lot of drought and very short grass. But in the rainy seasons, and in particular in swampy areas of the country, you can hide half an elephant quite happily. And not only can you hide an elephant, every once in a while you might find the grass is high enough actually to hide a giraffe. Now, you can argue as to whether this is an adult giraffe or is it a baby giraffe? Is it standing up? Is it lying down? I would like to think that this is an adult standing up, but okay, maybe not. But there are times of year when the grass is really long, before the wildebeest have come along and grazed it down to nearly nothing. A lot of the year the grass will be a lot shorter, just a few centimetres like this shot. This is one of my favourite images because it shows zebras at sunrise. The sun is just off to the top left of the image, and the sun is just catching some of the fur, especially the baby zebra, and the sun is just catching the ears of the zebra there, and the sun is just catching the seed heads of some of the grass that the zebras are munching on. But I also like it because it's a nice family portrait. It is zebras doing what zebras do, which is most of the time very little other than eat. So most of them have got their heads down eating. One of them has got the head up, watching for danger. And that's pretty much what zebras do. There is no lack of birds in East Africa. My friends in particular are very keen photographers of birds, and so over the years we've collected quite a few images of beautiful birds of East Africa. Starlings in particular, one on the right for instance, can be beautiful when caught in the sunshine. The red-winged starling on the left, even though its colours are a little less colourful, still looks spectacular. We in the UK have a starling. In East Africa they have dozens of starlings, all of which can look spectacular. There's no lack of small birds. I won't go through all of them. I'll make these handouts available for anybody that's interested in actually tying up each of the birds to their names indicated at the bottom of the screen there. Lots of small birds, some of which are very colourful. The one in the top right is very similar to the kingfisher that we have in the UK. Again, in East Africa, they don't just have a kingfisher, they have a collection of different kingfishers. Bee-eaters, no lack of bee-eaters, some of which are very obliging in terms of lining themselves up on a branch here to be photographed, in this case from the Rufiji River. We were in a boat at the time photographing the birds on the sandbank. The lilac-breasted roller is the national bird of Kenya. Beautiful plumage, you can see the blues and the lilac there, but it's even more spectacular in flight. So whenever we see one on a branch, we often stop and photograph it and then wait for it to fly in the hope of trying to catch its beautiful flight feathers. Sometimes it refuses to budge, and other times we manage to catch it in the sunshine. Beautiful electric blue flight feathers. Some of the larger birds, I'm sure you recognise the ostrich and a number of different birds in the stork and in the heron family. There are some rather odd-looking birds out there, like the hammercop, for instance, and the Cory bustard on the right-hand side, and in the middle there's a couple of secretary birds. Fairly large birds and fairly sedate in the way they walk around looking for food. Of course, there's always the raptors. There are various buzzards. There are lots of eagles and lots of vultures. These birds tend to soar, so if you find yourself in the right place, either over the plains or perhaps close to a hill where there's a little bit of an updraft, you will often find the birds soaring over your head. So if you get the timing right, again, you can get some good shots with a 300mm lens. Clearly, you don't photograph them when they are soaring 1 kilometre above your head, but there are plenty of opportunities when they get a lot closer. Plenty of raptors, some big, some small, and the beauty of digital photography is, even though the bird might be some distance away, if you wish, you can simply crop a little bit of the image down. You don't have to worry about the grain of the film, and therefore you can end up with a wonderful crop, which is only a tiny fraction of the whole image. Even though this bird was many, many tens of meters away, a 300mm lens gives you a very nice image. Occasionally you come across something which at first sight looks rather odd. This particular bird seems to have a head that had exploded. Maybe it was just a bad hair day. Well, the bird didn't move much for a minute or two, and we weren't sure exactly what we were looking at until it turns its head around. And then we realised we were looking at a juvenile eagle, probably a tawny eagle by the looks of it. And the left-hand image is simply with the bird whose head had rotated 180 degrees or thereabouts, and the feathers on the back of its head simply wouldn't lie flat when it had turned its head to that degree. So it gives a very odd result, very odd appearance, until it decided to turn back roughly in our direction. But birds either close to the lakes or in the rivers, there are lots of water birds, lots of wading birds. In the bottom left there's a lily trotter, where I've taken a relatively wide angle view of the lily trotter with all of the lilies around it. Again, you can always crop it tighter if you so wish to show the bird more clearly, but I would argue that it's good to show the context of the bird. If it's a lily trotter, in this case an African jacana, one of the lily trotter family, it's worth showing its environment. And if you go to the lakes, not surprisingly, you will see flamingo, perhaps thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of flamingo. But whenever you've got birds near water, it's always worth thinking about where can I get a very nice reflection. In this case, lots of pelicans, great white pelicans at the top, and at the bottom there, a selection of different birds, flamingo, heron, etc. And even the cormorant, familiar as the symbol of Liverpool. There we have a great cormorant, the same species as we would see in the UK. And given their proximity to water, there's always a possibility of a nice reflection. And that's true not just for the water birds themselves, it's true of the mammals as well. So whenever you have a shallow area of water, you will find animals will walk into the water, like the elephant on the left, which is feeding and drinking. I'm not sure what the zebra on the right is thinking. It seems to be walking on water. It just means it's extremely shallow there, barely a centimetre or so deep in this particular lake. And in the middle, an impala deciding to do a jump, trying to work out which is sky and which is water. Don't be fooled, they're both water. The sky actually isn't in this image, it's off the top there. It's a water area split into two by a little bit of grass. There's always a little bit of fighting. In this case, it's play fighting of a couple of lions. A couple of young brothers are play fighting during the day because any hunting is done during the night. So during the day, they just sleep and play. But of course, some fighting is not play. Some fighting is for real. The vultures in the top left, I'm not actually sure what they're fighting over. It might be a couple of parents deciding to get the youngster to leave. Hippos always fighting over territory in the river. Buffaloes fighting just because they're buffaloes. And there's always lions and hyena fighting over a kill. But the animals don't always just fight themselves. Occasionally animals will have a pop at us. There's always a bull elephant that thinks it's fun to go chasing tourists. And in this particular case, the elephant chased us down the road a while before it got fed up and let us drive away. There's always serendipity. Whenever you're doing wildlife photography, there's always the stroke of luck that you can never plan for. In this particular case, I was aiming to get a picture of the crowned crane standing on the left at the top of this particular tree, but as I was about to take a picture of this bird, its mate came from behind and decided to land on the tree right next to its mate. The air brakes came on, the wings came open, and it landed right next, such that its wings just sort of partly framed its mate on the top of the tree. I couldn't have planned that better if I'd tried. And every once in a while you simply come across something that's interesting. My friend said, "What's that in that tree?" We looked at the tree, couldn't quite make it out. When we got closer, it turns out to be a lion in the tree. Who would have thought? And on the way back to the lodge, the sun was going down, but just as we were heading back to the camp, well, a cheetah decided to run alongside the van and race us for a little while, and reminded us just how fast these animals can be, especially when the light is fading and you're forced to use a rather long shutter speed and you can't possibly catch the speed of these animals. Sorry about the title here, it had to be done. Whenever you have zebras crossing in front of your line of sight, it's obligatory to shout out zebra crossing. In this particular case, we had visited a national park that we'd been to before, and when we visited this previously, this was just an open, dusty plain. But this year, it was absolutely flooded. You'd think perhaps that was because of recent rains. Well, not in this particular case. It looked like something had changed in the underground aquifers, and so this area flooded, even though there wasn't torrential rain earlier. And the animals, the flamingos of course, love it, and the zebras just see it as a mild inconvenience, having to walk across the water rather than walk through the dry area. But most animals are more than happy if there's plenty of water around. Perhaps that's enough of the animals, a little bit of a yawning session here. I'm not sure if anybody is yawning in the room. On Zoom, I can't really tell. But now that the sun is setting, we have the opportunity to take some sunset photos or to think about starting to set up for astrophotography. So I said earlier that I'd tried a few attempts at astrophotography from Africa, but was getting frustrated by the fact that a camera on a fixed tripod meant that the stars were always trailing. So I decided to build myself a star tracker, and this is the star tracker I built. I called it K2 simply because I'd built another star tracker many years ago, so this was the second design that I came up with. It's a very simple design, bits of aluminium and a couple of batteries driving a motor and a potentiometer just to control the speed, and there's a couple of hinges at the back, and as the motor turns it drives and rotates on these hinges. This top arm moves upwards and the camera bolted onto the top there would rotate at 1 revolution per day. In other words, the potentiometer is there just to control the speed to make sure it does rotate at 1 revolution per day. So if you then line it up with the Earth's axis, then it will move the camera in the opposite direction to the Earth's rotation, and so the stars should appear stationary, and instead of getting star trails, we'll then get points of light. I used that for many a long year, taking that to East Africa a few times, getting a few questions from the people at the airport X-ray machine as to what this odd object was that they were seeing on the X-rays. But more recently I decided to change to a commercial star tracker. When I first built my star tracker there were very few available, but these days there's lots on the market. You can buy star trackers for anything from 100 to 200 or more pounds. Lots of different designs, lots of different manufacturers. This is the one I opted for some 10 or so years ago. It's one made by Ioptron, but other makes are available. What's in a star tracker? Well, it's effectively just a motor in a box. When the camera is bolted onto the front of the tracker and you have a little polar scope to make sure it's lined up with the pole, then the tracker will turn the camera regardless of where the camera is pointing to and keep your images nice and sharp. It is, I'm not going to talk in detail, but it is a little bit of a problem. Lining up on Polaris is easy enough from the United Kingdom when Polaris is nice and high on the sky, in the sky. But if you're, for instance, in East Africa, very close to the equator, then the North Pole and the South Pole are both on the horizon, which means polar scopes don't work too well. But that's another problem. I'll answer any questions in the Q&A if you're interested. So what's in a star tracker? Well, they're basically quite simple. A bit like the star tracker that I built, they're basically just a motor in a box. So in this particular star tracker, a couple of, 4 AA batteries, a little bit of circuitry to make this motor run at the right speed, and then it's geared down enormously so that this worm will drive the gear at 1 revolution in 23 hours and 56 minutes, 1 sidereal day, to make sure that it derotates the Earth enough to keep your stars nice and sharp. And so pointing it at the night sky, there's a little bit of light hitting the trees simply because any camp or lodge that you go to, that for safety reasons they have to illuminate the paths so you can see whether you're walking, and there will be a little bit of light bouncing off the paths. So the trees are not lit up anything like as bright as this would indicate. This is a single 20-second exposure, and because of the sensitivity of digital photography, the trees look like they're illuminated even though they're not. But a single image of 20 seconds shows an enormous amount of detail. And indeed, I found that the Large Magellanic Clouds, they don't rise very high as seen from the equator. The Magellanic Clouds are quite close to the South Pole, so it wasn't very high in the sky seen from Kenya, but it was still possible to capture the Large Magellanic Cloud. If you look at the bottom there, you notice that the lens used was an 85mm lens, so you don't need a 300mm lens to take interesting astrophotos. You can sometimes take interesting wide-angle pictures of the sky, but even if you're interested in very specific objects like the LMC, then an 85mm lens is all you need, because this object is significantly larger than the full moon seen in the sky. The same is true for the Carina Nebula, for instance. Eta Carinae, right at the centre of this nebula, has been shrugging off some of the outer layers of the star. It's a very massive star which appears to be very unstable, and the outer layers of this star have been shrugged off for probably many thousands of years to produce this nebula. The pink you can see here is from the hydrogen. Hydrogen glows pink when it's excited, and again this is taken with an 85mm lens. You don't need long telephoto lenses to get interesting objects in the night sky. This object is about some 2 degrees in diameter, 4 times the diameter of the full moon. So even a 300mm lens would perhaps be a bit too much to try and get all of this nebula in. You notice this particular case, I was taking a number of 1-minute exposures. This particular image is 15 lots of 1 minute. I usually take a whole series of short exposures such that if anything goes wrong with any of those exposures, I can throw them away and stack the remaining images together in software, which is either free or you can purchase if you wish, to stack the images to give you the equivalent of a longer exposure. In terms of doing wide-angle photography, the Milky Way is absolutely spectacular. If you go to a dark sky site in the UK, you can see the Milky Way stretching across the summer sky. This is my attempt at indicating what the Milky Way looks like from the UK compared to, here we go, what it looks like from East Africa. The amount of detail you can see by eye is phenomenal. You can see all of the dark lanes, the dark dusty structure, as well as the brighter parts of the centre of the Milky Way. The centre of our galaxy is much higher in the sky than it is as seen from the UK. From our vantage point at 52 degrees north, the centre of the galaxy is rather low down on the horizon during the summer months, but from the equator it's much higher in the sky. And as soon as you photograph it, of course, not only can you see all of that detail, but you get the colour coming out as well, which you can't generally see with your eyes, simply because the colour receptors in your eye don't tend to work too well in low light conditions. So this was a few images taken with a 35mm lens, because of course the Milky Way straddles a huge part of the sky, and in this particular case I took a series of 10 2-minute exposures. There's an awful lot of detail in the image, so much detail that you could still see some of the bright stars, but there are so many faint stars it starts to get difficult to see some of the constellations themselves. So the constellation of Scorpius, the characteristic S shape of Scorpius, is still there next to the centre of the Milky Way, but it's very difficult to see compared to, for instance, the image I showed earlier taken with ISO 200 slide film, in which case the stars are very easy to see. So there again is the familiar outline of Scorpius, one of the few constellations that does actually look like its namesake. And the centre of the Milky Way is difficult to see because we can see the bright stars but not the fainter Milky Way, compared to what we're seeing in this image, where because of the sensitivity of digital photography, we are seeing the bright stars and huge numbers of faint stars and all of the detail in the Milky Way. So just to convince you that Scorpius is still there, let me outline it for you. There it is. There's the bright star Antares and all of the other stars in the main constellation of Scorpius. If you wish, you can take a wide-angle shot like this, and then you can start homing in on the detail. We have two interlopers in this particular shot. The two brightest stars in this case are not stars, but we have Jupiter and Saturn. This shot was taken in 2019, when Jupiter and Saturn were relatively close together in the sky. But even with a wide-angle lens, you can still start looking at all of the detail of all of the star clusters and all of the nebulae that are visible in a shot like this. So here's just a few of the brightest. Here are the M numbers. I haven't showed you all the NGC star clusters and star nebulae, simply because there would be just too many of them. In this particular case, it looks like there's a whole load of interesting Messier numbers, but no interesting clusters down in the south there? Well, no, it's not a question of no interesting clusters. It's simply a case that Messier, the 18th century astronomer working mainly from France, couldn't see any further south than that line from his home country of France. And hence the M numbers run out when you reach that particular point. I was interested to know whether or not there would be any more detail if I switched to a different lens and, for instance, looked at the Lagoon Nebula and the Trifid Nebula, which are both inside that red rectangle. The red rectangle is roughly the field of view of a 300mm lens. Remember, the image you're looking at is from a 35mm lens. So I thought I'd switch back to using a telephoto, the one I normally use for lions and zebra, take that telephoto lens, swap it for the wide angle and see what I could get with the telephoto. And yes, there's the Lagoon Nebula M8 and the Trifid Nebula M20. And there's certainly structure to be seen in the Trifid. We can see the pink and we can see the blue colours of the nebulae, and we can see the sort of trefoil shape of the Trifid itself. That was actually just a single exposure. In this particular case, I took a number of images of the Milky Way with the wide angle, and this particular image you're looking at on the right inset is actually a single 30-second with no flats and no darks, just a single 30-second JPEG image. And that's what you can get from a beautifully dark sky. So I guess the take-home message is, if you're going somewhere nice, you might be going somewhere, whether it be Americas or whether it be Africa or Asia, you may be going somewhere because of your interest in natural history and interest in the wildlife. But it's worth thinking about packing a star tracker. They only weigh barely a kilogram or so, and even a small kilogram star tracker in your luggage, if you're taking a camera anyway because you're interested in the wildlife, why not take a tracker with you, in which case you'll be able to open up the beautiful dark skies of some of these more remote areas where you can get a long, long, long way away from light pollution. Definitely worth thinking about for your next outing when you go somewhere beyond just down your road to take a picture of the night sky. So that basically is the end of Wild Astronomy. So I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Excellent.